Good morning. Today is Thursday, July 10th, 2025. In the last number of years, when my family gets together, I have to put a brake on discussions of politics. Because in my family, among my children and their spouses, there are very different political opinions about the government in Canada, about the government in the United States, about Israel. And I am sorry to say, I wish it was not like this, but I'm sorry to say that the conversation can get heated. And that's not what I want around the Shabbos table or the Pesach Seder or Thanksgiving table. So I usually break in with something like, "How are the Habs doing?" Now, I know that other families have it worse, where family members who hold opposing views are so entrenched, and the tone with which they express them becomes vitriolic, and sometimes in extreme cases reaches the point where people simply can't speak to each other and therefore don't want to be with each other. You may have experienced this, or you may know of someone or a family who has. So I want to share with you this morning some suggestions of how to help that situation. From Daniel Taub. Daniel Taub is a former Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. And he says that genuine conversations are extremely rare. And he wrote a book with which he hopes to change that. He wrote a book that he hopes will get many of us to engage in difficult conversations in a new and ultimately more Jewish way. So I want to share with you part of an interview that Daniel Gordis did with Daniel Taub a few weeks ago. Daniel Taub was born in Britain, made Aliyah in 1989. He served in the IDF and in the reserves. In 1991, he started working for the Israeli foreign minister. He served as a member of Israel's negotiation teams in the Israeli-Syrian and Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And as I mentioned, he served as ambassador to the United Kingdom. He's written a number of very important books and has done incredible things in many areas of life. And he is an accredited mediator, and he runs workshops on difficult conversations where he tries to put into practice his ideas, and he has collected them into this book. And his new book, which I highly recommend, is titled Beyond Dispute: Rediscovering the Jewish Art of Constructive Disagreement. So, okay, we're going to learn how to disagree constructively and civilly, but it is going to be a Jewish art. So let's see what he says. So first, about the Jewish part. It's very, very interesting. He talks about a shift that occurred in Jewish history around the time that the Second Temple was destroyed, so about 2,000 years ago. And he argues that around that time there arose what he calls the rabbinic approach to argument. And that arose in the context and with the background of a crisis in society. That there was a loss of trust in authority, a loss of trust in information, lack of social spaces because the Jews were now being exiled and moved to the northern part of Israel and all throughout the exile. And there was increased factionalization. And it was a social crisis that in some ways is similar to the social crises we are facing today. So, just to take a very simplistic look at this, what he argues is that earlier, the way to think about something and to arrive at a conclusion was it comes in a bolt of lightning from God. We have a Torah, we have prophets, and they tell us what to do. But when that bolt of lightning goes away, and when there are no more prophets and there are no more miracles, which is the situation at the beginning of the Talmudic era, the end of the Second Temple, then the rabbis of the Talmud came up with an alternative. There's a midrash that says that God takes the concept of truth in heaven and smashes it to earth in 1,000,000 pieces. And so he learns from this using a quote of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks: truth above, but truths below. Meaning there's one truth that comes from God, Shema Yisrael or Shabbos, the mitzvahs from Hashem, that's one truth. But once we start discussing different opinions, then there's going to be more than one truth. He says something fascinating. And I've addressed this before and given different answers to this, but this is a whole new way to look at it. Remember that when Moshe received the first tablets of the Luchos, the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments, and when Moshe saw the golden calf, he broke them and smashed them into pieces. And then Moshe went back up, and eventually there was a second set of Luchos. And they are the ones that were preserved. But you remember I told you that Luchos v'shivrei Luchos munachim ba'aron. The second Luchos, which were whole, were put in the ark, in the Mishkan, then the Beit HaMikdash, but also the pieces of the broken Luchos. Why were the pieces of the broken Luchos put into the ark? He suggests, because they were dangerous. Because if someone would get a hold of one piece and think to themselves, this is the whole truth, they would be making a mistake. Because another piece holds another truth, and a third piece holds a third truth. So it was necessary to keep them all together so no one would take any one part of it and think that they had the whole truth. And this is the notion that truth is not within us, but it is between us. You and I can argue about something, and there can be an aspect in which you are correct and an aspect in which I am correct. Once we're not dealing with Torah being given by God or messages being sent by a prophet, then among human beings, there's more than one opinion. And that's exactly the style of the Mishnah. When Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, put together the Mishnah, he did not put together a code of law. He put together a work that included the main differences of opinion on every single topic in Jewish law. And he preserved them because he was not trying to create an authoritative text. This is what you must do. He was trying to create a holy argument. We can disagree. Now, before we go any further, I must add this because this next piece is crucial. It's very important to clarify that this does not suggest that every single opinion has merit and every single opinion should be respected and listened to and has the right to be shown. No. Our sages tell us, Shivim panim la Torah. There are 70 facets to the Torah. There's 70 ways of looking at the Torah. Every word in the Torah, every concept, every narrative, there are 70 ways of looking at it. Multiple ways, each of which has a certain amount of truth. But there could be a 71st way that falls outside the realm of legitimacy. And the litmus test is that the person who is putting forth an opinion has to be committed to the rules of the game, has to be committed to the integrity of the Torah, to the way the rules work, and accepted as one of the people that is authorized to discuss this. It's not true that everybody's opinion deserves respect. You know the old saying, a person can be in danger of being so open-minded that your brains fall out. So he gives an example where we're not talking about Torah, but we're talking, let's say, about politics or policy, for example. He says somebody would be outside the bounds of legitimate debate if they say that there is no evidence you can bring me that would make me change my mind. Because once a person says that, then there's no value to any kind of conversation. It stops right there. And we find in the Talmud that there were a couple of examples where great scholars in the Talmud were expelled from the study hall because they held a position and they simply said, there is nothing you can say that will get me to change my position. Then what's the grounds for even engaging with them? In his workshops on having constructive, difficult conversations, he says one of the things that's frustrating when people come to join in the beginning is that people think that if I'm going to have a workshop about discussing a difficult topic, we're going to look at the other person to talk about how his opinion is so unreasonable. How could he hold such an unreasonable opinion? But the truth is, he starts his workshops not by looking across the table, but by looking inwards. Because, and this is very logical if you think about it, it's logical to assume that in most arguments, I am 50% of the argument. So, if I want to try to imagine that the other side could change their mind, right? That's what I want to do. I want the other side to change their mind. Then it would be a good idea to start for me to look inside myself and to say, what would it take me to change my mind? And if there's no way I would be willing to change my mind no matter what the other person says, how can I expect the other person to act any differently and change their mind no matter what I say? He says we need to be confident in identity, but we need to be humble in relation to our particular positions. We need to recognize our positions are a work in progress. We need to recognize we are not an expert in military strategy. We are not an expert in what should be happening to help Nebuch, the terrible disaster in Texas. We're not an expert in whether there should be bombing here or not, or what Iran is going to do, or what to do about the hostage. All these things. We have to just be a little humble. We're not the experts in this. We can have opinions. We should be able to discuss it civilly. But we have to recognize we're not the experts. And that means that the truth is not found within you, and the truth is not found within me. The truth is found between you and me. And he says that's what's meant by this fantastic comment of the rabbis, machlokus l'shem shamayim, a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven. It's a disagreement where we're both trying to come to the truth. We're both willing to accept what the other will say if it can convince us. That's a machlokus l'shem shamayim. So then he shares several very practical steps for family gatherings, family meals, where this kind of conversation could become problematic. So the first thing he says is, if you're gathered around the Pesach Seder, or in America, the Thanksgiving table, whatever it is, and you are thinking of having a conversation about a volatile subject, take it offline. It doesn't have to be with the whole group. The Seder table is not the place. Because when it's a large group, it's not just the issues, it's the personalities, it's the egos. It's never going to work in a large group. Take it quietly. Discuss it among yourselves, you and the other person, 2 or 3 people, not the whole group. It'll never work. And the second thing he suggests is really interesting. He suggests that before stating an opinion that's controversial, first set the groundwork of what the family means to you. Why it is important that we are able to speak to each other. What does it mean that we're members of the same family? That is so important, because if you can start like that, you're starting with the assumption that we cannot let this get out of hand. We cannot let this get out of control. Because we're part of the family, because we have to get along, because we have to live with each other, whatever it is. But start with that conversation. Maybe a story about the family relationship before you start anything controversial. And another aspect of this, start with a conversation about why your relationship with each other is so important. Why it is necessary for you and I to be able to discuss something and at the end of it still be able to speak to each other. Start with that. Why is that? Verbalize it. And then go on to the subject you want to discuss. Because again, once you've discussed that, you've set the context that we are not going to let this get out of control. Another very good, very practical suggestion is when you want to state your opinion and you know that it's controversial, start with some personal stories. He writes that one of the questions he's asked very frequently, especially when he comes to speak in America, is by Jewish families, Jewish parents. They say, what do I say to my children? They're Jewish kids, but they're supporting the Palestinians. They think that Israel's wrong. And what do we say to them? He says it's a good idea to start with personal stories. Personal stories on what shaped your thinking. He gives an example. You could have a person, let's say, in this example, a grandparent. And let's say they're a Holocaust survivor or the child of a Holocaust survivor. And let's say they live their lives with a packed suitcase under their bed because they remember so well being woken as a child and forced out and having to flee. And they live their life with that insecurity. And when you hear a story from someone about how they come to view it, and therefore the threat of, let's just take this example, the threat of Hamas must be completely eradicated, because this is what I grew up with, this fear, this anxiety, this uncertainty. And it could be that the young person, let's say they're in university, they could say, well, you know, I'm sharing a room with somebody from Gaza. And all I hear all day is he or she is trying all day to try to reach their relatives to see if they're still alive. And that's how I'm coming to this. So the personal stories of what leads you to your opinions is a very, very good way to start, because it allows both sides to broaden their view. For me to think to myself, well, you know, there are different experiences. Maybe if I had different experiences, my opinion would be different. And then he suggests something very practical. He says, you know, if you and a family member or a close friend, you disagree about something serious, choose something you both agree to, a project, and engage in the project together. You disagree about what should be about Likud versus, you know, should the prime minister resign? Should he continue? Take a project, some project that you both agree is important. In Israel, there's so many. Here, there's so many. And do it together. That is, actually do it together. So that you will be able to see that on at least some issues, you're on the same side of the table. We need to find places where we're able to have these small conversations using these strategies to be able to have conversations that are difficult but that remain constructive and remain civil. Gordis ends by saying, we're living in a world in which hope is hard to come by. The ability to talk to people in the midst of this is very frightening and rapidly changing world may be critical to making sure that if it fractures, at least we don't fracture with each other. And that's what this book tries to do. So consider some of the ideas. If they apply to you, try to put some of them into practice. I will try to put some of them into practice. And see what the results are. And let me know what your experience is. But this is something we have got to get right. We have got to be able to find ways, certainly within our families and among our friends, to be able to have difficult conversations that are constructive and that remain civil, and that we remain united at the end of them. My friends, I thank you very, very much. I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.